Okay, another real life example. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about diarrhea and dehydration. So dehydration, pretty obvious, right? If you're having a lot of diarrhea and a lot of watery stools, that means you're losing water every time you go to the bathroom, right? So loss of water with diarrhea. So the thing is that not only are you losing water, you're also losing electrolytes as well, such as sodium, potassium chloride. So again, you're not just losing water, you're losing everything else that's making up the solid parts of that diarrhea. You also lose bicarbonate. So think about your mucus of your gastrointestinal tract, especially everything past the stomach. You have like bicarbonate in the mucus of your GI tract. So if you have diarrhea and a constant flow through your GI tract, you're also losing a lot of bicarbonate. So remember, from that bicarbonate buffer system, that's a weak base. So if you're losing a lot of base and alkaline ions from your body, your pH is going to drop because as you lose base, your body becomes more acidic. So with diarrhea, you typically see acidosis. So what happens to your bodily fluid tonicity? Well, you're losing water, you're losing electrolytes. So you want to replenish both. And you also want to counteract this acidification because again, but all that bicarbonate in your or not gastric, your GI mucus, especially in the duodenum and all throughout your intestines as well. So you want to not only replenish water, you want to replenish electrolytes, and you also want to bring your pH, body's pH back to normal and make it less acidic. So you want to compensate for this loss of base. So do you need an IV? Well, you could use an IV, and this is like, yeah, ER and dehydration, that's the typical protocol. But what if you don't want to want to save money and don't want to go to the ER? What can you do instead of having an IV? Well, you can just use this. So something like Pedialyte. So again, if you have someone who's dehydrated, or if you have an athlete and they're working out in the hot sun for a year, for like not years, for hours, like say someone's running a marathon, you just give them a Gatorade, something with both water and electrolytes, and maybe a little bicarb as well. So this is what we're having here. We're trying to prevent dehydration, and you can do that via orally. You don't have to necessarily need to use an IV. Maybe in an emergency situation, but if it's not an emergency, you can use just drink it. So oral rehydration therapy, this is the WHO's recommended formula. So what do we have here? We have sodium chloride, potassium chloride, trisodium citrate, and glucose. So this is the WHO formula. You have sodium chloride and you have glucose. So the thing is like, I'll explain why we have glucose too. It's not just there for calories and osmolarity. So we have sodium chloride. Again, you're losing the electrolytes with the diarrhea. You also have potassium chloride. Again, potassium also important in terms of electrolyte balance. And during the neuroscience and neurophysiology lectures, you'll find out why potassium is very important for any excitable cell. Now, trisodium citrate. So this was actually previous formulation used to use bicarbonate, which is again a weak base. So citrate is actually the conjugate base of citric acid, which is also weak acid for like carbonic acid. So trisodium citrate is actually a base. So this is what allows to compensate from the bicarbonate loss due to diarrhea. So the thing is that actually, even though this is the WHO formula, and you might not have potassium chloride or trisodium citrate in your cupboard, but one time, like when I had like this really nasty stomach flu and had diarrhea, I actually made my own version of this. So think about glucose. If you don't, you can actually make your own version of this oral rehydration therapy. Sodium chloride, table salt, right? But instead of glucose, you can actually use the equal molar concentration of sucrose. So sucrose is just glucose plus fructose. So if you weigh out the same amount molar concentration of sucrose, you're going to get the same molar concentration of glucose. Now, potassium chloride, that might be hard to include, so you have to adjust the sodium that way. Maybe eat a banana. But things that you can also, previous formulations uses bicarbonate. So bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, you have that in your pantry. So if you're having acidosis due to the diarrhea, you can also counteract that acidosis by adding an equal molar concentration of bicarbonate to help counteract that. So we explained the sodium chloride, we explained the potassium chloride, and also the trisodium citrate, which acts as a base to counteract the acidification. Now what about that glucose? So the thing is that there's something called the sodium-dependent glucose link transporters, the SGLT. So what it is, so actually in the previous example, those were examples of antiport. So like in the sodium potassium exchange pump, what we had is like sodium moving toward the outside and potassium moving toward the inside. So they're going in opposite directions. This is what we call antiport. Now with the sodium dependent glucose link transporter, so you have all this glucose. So the thing is that it's kind of like for, for the SGLT, you need both sodium and glucose together. So if they're not both there, then they can't enter in the cell via this transporter. So glucose and sodium. So the thing is that sodium, the cell is bringing in glucose, but it's also bringing sodium along for the ride. So it's kind of like a plus one. Like if you're trying to get into like a really exclusive place, and then your friend has like all the VIP hookups, and you're the plus one. So sodium and glucose are kind of like that in this case. There's like a restricted area, but they're both there. They're the plus ones. So now they're being brought in together. This is an example of symport, and this is why glucose is included in that WHO formula. As you have more glucose, because the cell is trying to bring in this glucose, it also brings in more sodium. Now, what happens if you do this repeatedly? Well, what happens to the glucose and sodium concentrations? What happens to the solute concentrations inside of the cell? So notice that you have more glucose, you have more ions as well. So this is an example of secondary active transport. Again, you didn't see any ATP in that example, but now you have increased solutes inside of the cell. This is going to help to draw even more water via osmosis from the extracellular fluid into the cells. So again, this is why you have the addition of glucose in that WHO formula. Due to using this SGLT, this allows the increased absorption of solutes, so you get more absorption of water via osmosis and more rehydration of the patient who has dehydration. Okay, so this is what you all learned today. So again, it's like I told you I would go through all those learning objectives. And so hopefully you learned a lot, and I will cover more about Fick's laws and diffusion in the respiratory lectures.